And I thought you had moved down to Sepang a year or two before COVID.
We
Uh,
actually moved. We moved half of our operations to Sepang about 2 years before COVID.
right. Okay. And what was the reasoning behind that? Was that a business decision for
Sure,
country?
sure, sure. One, Zhuhai and most racetracks in China are very hard to operate.
Oh,
Very hard, very hard to operate at these circuits. They don't really value race teams or race schools in China as much as they do corporate track days and the ability to extract money from Mercedes or Bentley or Lamborghini or Audi, you know. So it becomes more difficult for race teams to survive in China. Um, so we made a decision to move the operations, mainly the operations in Zhuhai, with the exception of F4. We moved the operations into Sepang. Also because F3 was racing in Sepang and in Thailand at that time, it made it logistically easier, you know. So yeah, it was a business move based on the revenue, but also based on the cost of operating.
okay. So I didn't I've only had when it comes to China, I've only had the experiences of going to the big race weekends to cover the big series there, and I haven't had that in-depth experience of working with the Chinese in. I mean, you were running an everyday business at the Zhuhai racetrack there. Uh, do you think because pre-COVID, China was a very important part of Asia and Asian motorsport because there were three circuits that were being used in most of the Asian regional series there. Uh, was it? But it was still very hard for sponsors and even race promoters to crack into Asia and do a proper good job of it. Uh, would you say that the China motorsport industry was well, run completely different to the rest of Asia?
Well, actually, one of the things I would say about racing in China, I think when we raced F4 in China, F4 is obviously is an FIA backed race series, you know, and my time, the organizer of F4 in China, is very professional. F4 was a relatively well run race series, okay,
Yeah.
compared to local race series run by, let's say, Zhuhai or GIC in Guangdong province or even Shanghai. Ningbo is a little bit better because Ningbo is actually owned by Geely, and you know the organization that runs China 4 is also associated with Geely. So Ningbo is a little bit better run. But I think it's difficult to operate in those other race series. You know, even China GT. David tried to get TCR Asia and TCR China together. It's more difficult to operate in China for sure. The race circuits are run um, with really a focus on both politics and really corporate sort of profits, you know. And I think it's a harsh environment for race teams. You know, it's a harsh environment, and for a race team that's sort of an international race team. I mean, we're trying to be Asia wide, and we bring international drivers into Asia, and we bring Asian drivers to race internationally. Um, for us, it was even more difficult politically, maybe in some ways. You know, I mean, we're four expats running a race team in operating mostly in China, and I think for us it was uh, you know, look, I worked in China for 30 years. I
Oh,
mean,
wow.
you know, it's not it was a good place to work, but for a race team, it's a tough environment. You know, I think no one really. There's an idea that race teams are the font of money. You know, that somehow we have money to burn, and that's the way we're treated at these race circuits. You know,
Right.
Sepang is a little bit different. Sepang is better in some ways. You know, they understand that the race teams have to survive.
Mm.
Um, Ningbo, I also think, was a lot better, a much better environment. You know, because my time and Geely, they understand race teams have to survive. But Shanghai, Zhuhai, GIC, it's a different ballgame, man. It's a different ballgame.
Yeah, it sounds like what yeah, how I see Southeast Asia motorsport, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, it's it's run by ex-racers. They're actual racers, like the presidents and the CEOs of the motorsport associations, the ASNs. These are well, some of them are still racing, but they've got the racing mentality, but it sounds like China was more of the corporate business
Yeah, you know, I
and not
mean, there are really good race series run in China. You know, so for example, F4 is really a decent race series now. Unfortunately, um, especially over the past 2.5, 3 years, there's not a lot of competition. There's not a high competitive level in F4 China. You know,
right.
mainly because international drivers can't participate, and that would up the game a little bit, you know. But I think China Touring Car Championship is a really well run championship. The CAF, the Chinese Motorsport Organization, is a very well run motorsport organization, right?
Mm.
But you know what happens is China Touring Car Championship ends up being dominated by manufacturers. The manufacturers are always looking for political advantage. You know, I mean, that kind of stuff. You don't really see um, at that level in Sepang or in Thailand, or you don't really see that playing out in that kind of way. So that makes it difficult for race teams that are racing in those series as well. You know, if they're not
Mm.
sponsored by a big manufacturer, they're going to have difficult times. Now there are examples of people who have been able to navigate that and do very well. You know, and I think the real, as was said in your last interview, um, we've had really good competition in some of these series in Asia. The old F3 Asia, which is now Formula Regional Asia Championship, has produced, a small handful of F3 and F2 drivers, international uh, drivers, right? One of them, and pretty soon, maybe two or three of them, are in F1.
Yeah.
So those series actually have high level of competition. Um, they're well run. China F4 has the potential to be like that. Um, Certainly, Southeast Asia F4 had the potential to be like that. The real problem all around is one, right now the situation in China is it's not open.
Mm.
Even Macau, the past 2 years, as you know, the Macau Grand Prix has been F4, and it's been really no international drivers, really. Um, so this zero COVID stuff and the pandemic, and then the policies around the pandemic, and the difficulty that China, Hong Kong, and Macau have dealing with the pandemic. Those things have made motorsports in China and motorsports in Asia take a big step backwards. I mean, you're absolutely right. I think there are some really, at least three and maybe more, top class circuits in China that we'd like to be racing at. Still.
Yeah.
but we can't get people and cars into those venues. Macau is a world class event. You know, every year before November, I have plenty of drivers and their parents and their sponsors contacting me about racing in Macau. Uh, but it's just impossible for the drivers and their families to get into Macau, and then it's impossible for me to put a proper crew together to work the races. You know, I mean, so I think the past 2.5, 3 years have been very difficult for motorsports in Asia because of that. The success of our team was really when we had a mixture of both Asian and international drivers. That's how we won the Formula Renault Championship so many times. That's how we won the Formula 3 Asian Championship in 2020. That kind of synergy between one or two decent international drivers and some really good Asian drivers really helped us build our business and helped us win championships. But it's more difficult to do that now.
Mm. I,
As you know, F3 Asia is now called Formula Regional Asia Championship. But for the past 2 years, it's been held in the United Arab Emirates. It's been in the
yeah.
UAE. We haven't raced in Asia for almost 3 years. The Formula Regional Asia Championship now.
Is that must have an effect on your strategic partners as well, your sponsors?
Well,
Uh,
of course, we've lost our sponsors because of this.
yeah, because the last 2 years, yeah, every single race, all the 15 races have been at the same track, right? Oh, two tracks, Abu Dhabi, sorry,
And
Abu Dhabi and Yas Marina, right?
no, Yas Marina and Dubai.
Dubai, yeah.
Yeah.
And do you see? I mean, as a resident of Hong Kong, are you able to leave Hong Kong at the moment, or you're stuck in there?
Sure, I could leave if I'm willing to do, come back and do a quarantine in a severely overpriced quarantine hotel. I mean, but for us, there are minimal flights leaving Hong Kong right now, and they cost treble what they used to cost.
Right.
And the hotels have these quarantine hotels have jacked up their rates about 2.5 to 3 times what their normal rates would be. So I mean, right now, if I can get a flight, yeah, I could go to the Middle East and then come back and do quarantine. This past season, the quarantine was, I would have had to come back and do 14 days in a severely overpriced hotel.
Prison
So,
cell, basically.
yeah, basically. And, this is killing the economy in Hong Kong. It's really driving people out of Hong Kong. But for race teams, it becomes even more difficult. So if you really want to run if you want to run a race team right now, you have to be competing really outside of China. I mean, there are teams inside China, and that's all they do. Chinese drivers inside China. And then there are teams outside of China who are either region wide like us or Craft Bamboo, or who actually race both Asia wide and also internationally. It becomes more expensive for us. It becomes
Yeah.
more difficult to actually operate. I could tell you the past 2 years in the Formula 3 Asian Championship and now the Formula Regional Asia Championship, we haven't made any. I mean, we haven't made any money. We're lucky to break even, mainly because the costs have ratcheted up so much, and because the drivers don't have more money than they had before. Sponsors certainly are spending less money than they spent before.
Hmm.
In our case, our sponsors are gone. So the impact of the pandemic, yes, but also the impact of some of the policies around the pandemic have made it really difficult to operate. It's always been easy to get sponsors for Macau Grand Prix.
Yeah.
So if we were able to field teams in the Macau Grand Prix, it would be easier to get sponsors for a full year. But if the only drivers eligible to race in Macau Grand Prix are China or Macau or somewhat Hong Kong based drivers, then it's much more difficult to get the kind of sponsorship and also to put together the kind of team that we're used to having. Believe me, I've turned down some really good international drivers because we couldn't put together for the Macau Grand Prix, we couldn't put together a team that we wanted to put together,
Right.
mainly because of the rules and regulations around this. So I think the pandemic has been particularly hard on us, the Asia based race teams.